Hi, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. As many of you know, my new book, The War on Science, is appearing July 29th of this year in the United States and Canada. And to celebrate that, we've interviewed many of the authors, of the 39 authors who have contributed to this volume. And we have 20 separate podcast interviews that will be airing over the next 20 days, starting July 22nd, before and after the book first appears, with many of the authors in the book on a host of different subjects. The authors we will have interviews with in order of appearance over the next 20 days are Richard Dawkins, Niall Ferguson, Nicholas Christakis, Maarten Boudry, Abigail Thompson, John Armstrong, Sally Satel, Solveig and Joshua Katz, Francis Widdowson, Carole Hooven, Janice Fiamengo, Geoff Horsman, Alessandro Strumia, Roger Cohen and Amy Wax, Peter Boghossian, Lauren Schwartz and Arthur Rousseau, Alex Byrne and Moti Gorin, Judith Sisa and Alice Sullivan, Carleen Gribble, and finally Dorian Abbott. The topics that will be discussed will range over the need for free speech and open inquiry in science and the need to preserve scientific integrity, stressed by our first podcast interviewee, Richard Dawkins, and will once again go over historical examples of how academia has been hijacked by ideology in the past and the negative consequences that have come from that, to issues of how specific disciplines, including mathematics, have been distorted, and how certain departments at universities now specifically claim that they are social activists, and a degree in their field is a degree in either critical social justice or social activism, not a degree in a specific area of scholarship, how ideology has permeated universities. We'll proceed also to discuss issues in medicine. Sally Satel will talk about how social justice has hijacked medicine. And also, when it comes to issues of gender-affirming care, we have a variety of authors who are going to speak about the issues there and how too often gender-affirming care claims are made that are not based on empirical evidence, in fact, falsely discuss the literature in ways that are harmful to young people. We'll talk to several people who, for one reason or another, have been canceled for saying things. Francis Widdowson at Mount Royal University in Canada, and Carole Hooven from Harvard, who eventually had to leave Harvard after saying on television that sex is binary in biology. We'll be talking to people who've looking at the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion in academia and how it's restricting free inquiry and also restricting, in many ways, scientific merit at those universities. And finally, Dorian Abbott, the last contributor to our series, will be talking about 3 principles he believes are essential to separate science and politics and keep academia free from ideology and more for open questioning and progress, and to make sure that science is based on empirical evidence, and where we go where the evidence is, whether it's convenient or not, whether it's politically correct or not, and we're willing to debate all ideas that nothing is sacred, a central feature of what science should be about and what, in some sense, this podcast is about. So I hope you really enjoy the next 20 days, and we've enjoyed bringing it to you. So with no further ado, The War on Science, the interviews. Well, Alex Byrne and Moti Gorin, I'm really happy you both joined me here. I'm really happy you both wrote an article for the War on Science book about a very important subject. But it's nice to meet you both virtually. It's always amazing to me in the modern world how one can be a co-author with someone and never actually have met them. But
Moti and I have actually met. So.
Yeah, Moti and you have, yes. But in any case, welcome. The title of your piece, of your article, is Deafening Silence, Bioethics and Gender-Affirming Healthcare. You are both philosophers, one in particular on bioethics, and you may not have watch the podcast, but this is an origins podcast, and I like to find out how people got to the point where we talk about what they're doing, and in this case, about the article. So I want to ask each of you some questions, and to get some sense of where you're coming from, and then we'll go through some of the ideas you bring up, and I'll ask you about. Alex, you're Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Philosophy at MIT, where I received my PhD a long time ago, and your interest has been philosophy of mind, a subject I spent a little time in my last book, and metaphysics. But before we get to how you got to sex and gender, which I want to ask about, I assume you were an undergraduate in the United Kingdom. Did you study philosophy? Is that what you?
Well, I didn't actually study philosophy first of all. I mean, like many people, I came to philosophy late. I actually started off studying physics.
Physics?
And then, yes, and then
that's the appropriate thing that anyone should study.
Extremely bad at that, so I switched to mathematics. I don't know whether that was a real improvement. And then so that was my first degree, and then after that, I actually worked in advertising in London for a number of years, and then I did a second philosophy undergraduate degree at Birkbeck College, London, which at the time was really fantastic for philosophy. It had some really great philosophers there.
Yeah, my friend
Anthony somewhat later in life, I found my way over to the States.
Oh, that's much more interesting.
To do a PhD.
Well, I often ask people why they didn't study physics, and now I'm glad to see I don't have to ask you that. Always amazes me.
I mean, I very much liked physics. I often, wished I'd been smart enough to be a theoretical physicist, but
it takes different times. Anyway. But it's good but I'm always happy to see that, as I say, that people at least lean that way. And in fact, that maybe answer my next question. But before we do, so just out of interest, my old friend Anthony Grayling, I think, taught at Birkbeck College, but I don't know whether he was.
Yes, I mean, of course, I certainly know of Anthony. I've read a number of his books. I don't think I ever met him.
I just wondered whether he was there. But anyway, so that's good. So you had real world experience, and then you went back. So you did your PhD in philosophy, though, at Princeton, right?
That's right. Yes. That's right.
Yeah. And okay.
And then I just stayed in this country ever since.
Another friend of mine, Peter Singer, teaches or taught at Princeton.
Oh, indeed. I mean, Peter has a connection to this whole issue because, of course, he started, along with Geoff McMahon and Francesca Minerva, the Journal of Controversial Ideas.
Yes.
And without that journal, there would have been even less pushback against orthodoxy and philosophy sex and gender than there has actually been.
Now, and that's good to know. Yes, in fact, we'll mention that at some point. It's really important that people can publish in a place that allows this discussion to happen, and it's really tragic that I was with Peter recently, and we both agreed that ideally the journal should go out of existence because it won't be necessary in the future.
Well, of course. I mean, it's like particularly bizarre that philosophy papers are getting published in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. You would have thought every single philosophy journal would have as its subtitle the Journal of Controversial Ideas.
That's what it's supposed to be. Exactly. And you make that point in the article, which you'll get to. The last thing I want to ask, and I don't know if it's because you studied physics, but I found it interesting that your positions have always been at sort of scientific institutions. You were a postdoc at Caltech and then moved to MIT.
That's right.
Is that just an accident, or is that a predilection?
I think it was just an accident. But it's very nice I like being around scientists.
Yeah, no,
they're generally more level-headed and evidence-based than humans.
Well, I like to think so. Although when I did my PhD at MIT, the great thing about MIT is you didn't have to take any classes, at least in physics. You just had to pass exams. But the only class I actually took was sort of it wasn't. It was from a philosopher. It was Noam Chomsky's class on American foreign policy. But in any case, okay, great. Now, last thing. Sorry, Moti, we'll get to you. How did you get to sex and gender? And I do want to briefly talk. You wrote a book called Trouble with Gender: Sex, Facts, and Gender Fictions, and it was canceled. So maybe we can talk about that for 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, I think I got into it because somewhat indirectly, as I'm sure you'll remember, there was a huge fuss in philosophy in 2017 when Rebecca Tuvel published an article in the feminist journal Hypatia called In Defense of Transracialism. And, superficially, Rebecca's message seemed all very progressive, that, we should extend the rights and courtesies that we, of course, do and should to transgender people to any transracial people. But, of course, that's not how it was received, and Rebecca was set upon by her colleagues who basically tried to completely destroy her reputation and have the article retracted, which fortunately it wasn't at the end. So I, along with like many philosophers in the profession, was completely horrified by that. And so just out of interest, I started looking into the literature on sex and gender. I'd always been interested in sex differences anyway, and evolutionary psychology, that kind of thing.
Well, since your philosophy of mind, it's a reasonable.
Yeah, that's right.
Thing.
And so I started thinking about these issues and writing a few things for online magazines and so on. And just a little later, after Rebecca's cancellation, there came the cancellation of Kathleen Stock, who was...
We'll talk about that.
Philosopher at the University of Sussex. And Kathleen's cancellation lasted for about 3 years, at the end of which she was driven out of her job. And I was just absolutely astounded by the fact that her main counselors were leading philosophers in the profession. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. So then I just got more and more interested in this topic and started writing more and more about it, and had various little cancellation episodes myself, although nothing as serious as Kathleen's or Rebecca's. And anyway, the more I delved into the philosophical literature, the more appalled I was by the generally very low quality of the philosophy. So I thought I could write an accessible trade book about sex and gender, and so that's what I did.
And Oxford University Press contracted it, and then
that's right.
That's
right. I had a contract from Oxford University Press, and then they declined to publish it on the grounds
claiming it was not appropriate for Oxford University Press.
Yeah, it wasn't like sufficiently sensitive or respectful or something like that. Even though I'd like bent over backwards to be
the typical argument. It's not. They don't. They never have the guts to say why. They always just couch it in some ridiculous argument, like it's not appropriate for us at the current time, or some ridiculous thing like that. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, it's. And we'll hit on all these topics, including the low quality of the philosophy about this issue that is published. But But Moti has been sitting by so patiently. I want to go to him.
Your origin story better be good, Moti. Looking forward to hearing it.
Anyway, I know. Yeah. So you're a philosopher. I mean, you're really a bioethicist. That's your prime work. But you study philosophy, I assume. And unlike Alex, maybe we're not fortunate enough to do it and start a degree in physics, I assume.
I did not start a degree in physics. I knew very early on that I wasn't smart enough for that, so I didn't even venture an attempt there. No, my majors as an undergrad were in philosophy and English.
Okay.
And then I took about 6 years off working various jobs in California, .com jobs as that first .com bubble was bursting, and so getting laid off and collecting unemployment for a while, and then getting another job with another company that would soon go out of business. And then decided to go to grad school. And yes, I ended up with a PhD in philosophy, and then had a postdoctoral fellowship at a medical school. And so that was 2 years of taking courses with and getting to know the empirical bioethics literature quite well, and learning
some
about
of it,
bioethics from the inside. And so my focus since then has been largely in biomedical ethics.
Okay, is that where Kaplan was?
He was at Penn. He wasn't he was already at NYU when I got there. So
I think he was at my university before that. I think that's how I knew him. But anyway.
But I don't know if he founded the department there, the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Penn. But he had been gone already for at least a few years
But I knew there was a big program in it there. Yeah.
Yeah. No, Zeke Emanuel was directing the program when I was there, was chairing the department.
Emanuel. Okay, that's interesting. And then you moved from there to Colorado State, where you are now.
That's correct. And I've been here for about 10 years. And yeah, that's right.
How did you guys start to collaborate? Now you both look puzzled.
I mean, in this area, there's
Yeah. I mean, it was basically hardly any of us. So
it's hard not to end up meeting people who share puzzlement and just, I don't remember.
I think we meet at the GenSpec conference in Denver.
That's how we met in person. But I had we been in touch before then?
I think
email or social media. I don't remember.
But you've written
anyway. It's a very small group.
Is this the first article you've written together? Or no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm very happy.
Only so far with other.
Yeah, we have others in the works.
Well, anytime we can bring people together, I love that.
I should say also, I mean, I read before I was really, had been thinking about these issues, but hadn't written anything. I read some of Alex's early work that he had published, on gender identity, for example, on Medium. He has a great essay on what is gender identity. Mm-hmm. And was, of course, following some of the same things going on in the profession that Alex just described with Rebecca Tuvel and Kathleen Stock. I had actually started to get a bit puzzled on some of these issues during my postdoc because somebody came in with a guest lecture on some, sex and gender issues. Mm-hmm. And they struck me as perplexing, given my understanding of feminism, which I learned very quickly, I guess, is outdated, where, mm-hmm. we don't reject stereotypes and social norms, but try to embody them. I thought that was very puzzling, and I asked about it and got a very hand-wavy response that didn't make much sense. So I started already thinking about these issues at that time, and then asked a trusted senior colleague whether this was an area that was prudent to sort of investigate. And what I was told was that it's a complex area in bioethics, and I had better learn very well both the conceptual stuff, but also the empirical stuff. And so that's, I got in touch with people on the empirical side of things, endocrinologists, psychiatrists. And once you start talking to them, you realize that the empirical work is just as confused and ill-founded as some of the conceptual work and philosophy that Alex just alluded to.
Okay, that's a good, I think, a good segue to now talk about what you guys were writing about. Let me read the some sentences from the opening of your article. The first sentence says, the, quote, affirming healthcare model for gender-distressed youth is endorsed by the medical establishment in the United States, but many European nations have retreated from it, something we'll come back to. Anyway, then you say, this controversy would be expected to attract the interest of philosophers and bioethicists, with a diverse range of opinions appearing in academic articles. However, when philosophers and bioethicists have ventured into print, they have almost invariably endorsed the affirmative approach, which involves life-changing medical interventions on children with psychological problems. As we'll explain, this is a sign that the process of academic research and writing is not functioning as it should. I don't know if you want to elaborate on it, but I think the idea is that philosophy is supposed to involve, well, as science, a dialectic, that scholarship moves back forward by ideas being attacked and either surviving and not surviving. And that was a surprise to both of you, I assume, that when you started to look at the literature, that it wasn't what you thought it would be.
I mean, I think it would have been a surprise to us if we'd looked back in 2017 or something. I don't think it was at all a surprise to us when we started writing the paper. I mean, there's an interesting contrast between the debate or lack of debate in philosophy and bioethics over gender-affirming care and abortion. Mm-hmm. So even though I think it's fair to say most philosophers who considered the issue very much pro-choice, nonetheless, that is a subject that you can freely discuss in philosophy, and you can write articles without much of a problem, defending the view that abortion is immoral, or it's the same thing as infanticide or something. That does seem to be some genuine debate within philosophy. I'm sure Moti knows more about this than than I do.
mean, you can and people do publish on the ethics of abortion, and when you teach the course, you try to make as compelling as you can views on all sides of the issue, so that students can recognize that whatever you do think in the end about the legal or moral right to an abortion, there really are important moral considerations to consider on all sides, and you try to be charitable to one's opponents, and that does not happen when it comes to pediatric gender medicine. And so that's a significant difference, and it's a radical difference, because it's the case now where even entertaining certain questions or supporting certain policies renders you not only wrong or misguided in the way that many liberals think pro-life people are, but somehow really borderline evil.
It's well, let's as we start delving into this, as you do in your article, let's sort of define, before one could talk about gender affirming, we want to talk about what it means. And you define gender dysphoria as an extreme aversion to one's sex body. And the important thing is that it can be early onset, as you point out, or late onset, mostly in heterosexual men, as you point out. But there's something new that happened around 2015. You say starting around 2015, clinicians noticed that a new presentation of adolescent onset gender dysphoria, mostly affecting girls. This was labeled rapid onset gender dysphoria by a certain physician, and it ignited an explosion of activist-driven controversy. So it's this treatment of gender dysphoria in children and this adolescent, this new burgeoning area of problems that didn't happen before, and that you really want to look at. And as you say, until comparatively recently, it wasn't routine to involve medicalization or even social transitions. That wasn't treated, and so I think you say that there was something called the Dutch Protocol, which governed things before sort of 2015-ish, or maybe even earlier, that got to be changed. So maybe you could expand upon that.
I mean, there was. I'll just say something and then pass it over to Moti. So very recently, there was a New York Times podcast called The Protocol, which is well worth listening to, which is all about the Dutch Protocol and how it came over and was transformed into a much more liberal regime, where the guardrails had completely dropped once it hit these shores. So children with early onset gender dysphoria were first treated with puberty blockers. Actually, the first one was treated in the late 80s. Is that right?
89, it was just a single case study.
Yeah. And more of them were treated in the 90s. There were various rationales for pausing puberty. One rationale was that if the child later transitioned, had cross-sex hormone treatment and then surgery, then they would be better able to pass as a member of the other sex. That was one rationale. Anyway, the Dutch had fairly strict restrictions on who was eligible for this treatment. You had to have had persistent gender dysphoria from a very early age, a supportive family, no serious psychopathology other than the gender dysphoria itself. And then it was brought to the US by a clinician called Laura Edwards-Leeper, who worked at the
Boston Children's.
Boston Children's, the gender not the gender management service, but the gender multi-specialty service.
Yes,
you
that's
said
right.
that's around 2007.
That's right.
2007.
Right, around 2007. And the story that the podcast tells, the New York Times podcast tells, is that, well, the Dutch approach was good and rigorous and actually helpful, beneficial to
cautious,
cautious, beneficial to these children's mental health. But then, not surprisingly, once it got to America, the more freewheeling America, some kind of Wild West version of medicine broke out. And now, as I said before, all the guardrails have dropped, and this is very bad. So the story they tell is that, pediatric medical transition is good if it closely follows the Dutch protocol, but it's not so good, and indeed positively harmful if we follow the more
child-led, gender-affirming approach.
Let's follow the gender-affirming, child-led.
Let's
child
get
is
there.
in the driving seat.
That's right.
Let's get there. I mean, it sounds to me like the proper analogy is that the Dutch kept their finger in the dike, and the Americans pulled it out.
Yes, right. That is the story that the podcast tells.
Yeah. Okay.
But just to add to that, the mere fact that there is this discussion on the New York Times podcast shows you that there is something to see here, something of great interest, which on which one could take a number of different positions, and of course that's exactly what is not happening.
Yeah, that's right.
In
publicly,
the philosophy journals.
This is clearly as you point out, and I think I have a great quote from you later on. This is a topic that if it was ever a topic for ripe for philosophers to debate, this would be it. And there isn't that debate happening. Instead, I'm shocked at this person, Diane Ehrensaft, who is the director of mental health at the University of California, San Francisco's Child and Adolescent Gender Center. God forbid, I would say, if I believed in God. But anyway, but you have a quote. So she defends the U.S. approach as follows, and I think this is quite remarkable. So I'm going to read your quote. The gender affirmative model is defined as a method of therapeutic care that includes allowing children to speak for themselves about their self-expressed gender identity and expressions, and provide support for them to evolve into their authentic gender selves, no matter at what age. Intervention should include social transition from one gender to another and or evolving gender non-conforming expressions and presentations, as well as later gender-affirming medical interventions, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormone surgeries, etc. And she conceives of this authentic gender self. I can't help but mention, this her gender creative child book that you talk about, with gender creative children and gender Priuses, half girl, half boy, gender ambidextrous children, gender Tootsie Roll Pops. And this idea that I guess children are in a position to fully understand their gender, especially before they're pubescent, is remarkable to me. I find it absolutely remarkable that people who work with children would think that, and so I would ask you to comment. Am I missing something?
I don't think you're missing anything. In noting that there's something strange going on. And if you talk to people in psychiatry and psychology who have studied child development, they too recognize that something has gone wrong. I mean, not all of them, but the ones who are willing to talk candidly will acknowledge that we've known for a very long time that young children, even adolescents, are going through profound periods of identity development and so on. And so to say that, a 6-year-old or even a 12-year-old knows with certainty, right, who they are. We don't make those sorts of claims with respect to any other characteristics of a person generally. Like, a 12-year-old might want to be a physicist, and then they've come to recognize that in fact they aren't as good at math as they had hoped to be, or they might, there's lots of changes. And that's a more superficial change having to do with, professional aspirations. But the same goes for even the kind of person that you take yourself to be. That is in flux our whole lives, to say nothing.
Well, I know I have to say, I know some people, some good friends, and women who were tomboys, and when they were younger felt like they should be a boy until, of course, they hit puberty, and then they felt like quite differently about it.
Well, what we don't. This is one of the things that I don't think we allude to this in the chapter, but we don't give the actual numbers. So that original Dutch protocol, that's the sort of backbone of this entire medical practice. Initially, they had 70 youth that they initially put on puberty blockers, and of those 70 youth, only one was heterosexual. And so what was known and reported for years is that many kids who are young and gender nonconforming, they just come to recognize via sexual development that they're gay, they're same-sex attracted, and they're intervening with the process of sexual development by prescribing the blockers. And so what happens there, arguably, is that people's psychosexual development is impacted, right? So rather than growing up to be, a butch lesbian or an effeminate gay man, they come to identify in a different way, and with medical procedures in place, come to appear a different way. So that's a plausible story about the risks of intervening with child and adolescent development, and forgetting that kids don't always know who they are.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I want to move ahead a little bit. You point out that all major medical associations, U.S. endorse this gender-affirming model, and the argument that's given, and one hears often, and you discuss it at some length, is the notion of preventing suicides among young people. And this claim is made, as you point out, including, I think, by the American Medical Association, that there is an association between gender-affirming care and lower odds of suicide. And that claim is made, as many things are made in the case of gender and many of the things we talk about in this book. The antithesis of science is making claims without evidence. And this is a claim for which often quotes are given to articles which don't even refer to suicide. So I want you to illuminate that a little bit, because I think it's an important issue, because a lot of people think, well, if we can prevent suicides, that's a good thing. But most of the work that's been done here apparently has been done not related necessarily to suicide directly. So either of you or both of you comment.
I mean, I think there's been one study, a Finnish study, I think, which directly examined the link between gender-affirming care and suicide, and didn't find any significant link once psychiatric comorbidities were accounted for. But it is certainly bizarre how, I mean, we quote the then Assistant Secretary of Health Rachel Levine in the Biden administration saying just flatly that gender-affirming care is suicide prevention care. And it is quite baffling why Rachel Levine thought that, or presumably she thought, this is all backed by evidence or something, but just what she was looking at, I've absolutely no idea.
Well, it seems to me, and I've seen this a lot, not just in the case of gender, but in case of other racism and other kind of ideological assertions, that what happens is one person says it, and then the next person references the first person that said it, and the third person references the last two people, and it looks like it's a site, and when you see the citations,
there's a lot of citational circularity that goes on. Actually, this was pointed out by Hilary Katz in the April 24 Katz review, that lots of these clinical practice guidelines, which seem superficially independent, are actually nothing but. They just draw on each other.
Well, to be maximally charitable, it is true that youth who identifies LGBTQ, etc., do have higher rates of suicidality. That's true. But it doesn't follow from that, of course, that X or Y intervention can reduce that, nor does it even follow that what explains the higher suicidality is being the L or the G, or in this case, the T, right? So I think what they're looking at is these kids are vulnerable. They're at higher risk.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
And parents really are worried about their kids because these kids really are struggling. So there's, there's self-harm going on.
Yeah.
There's psychiatric inpatient hospitalizations going on. They're struggling socially. These kids really are at risk, but the inference from that, at risk, from them being at risk to let's cut off their breasts when they're 15 years old. You need some serious argument between that premise and that conclusion. And that's what's missing.
Yeah. Okay. Now you point out, however, that's, and anyone who's followed this publicly knows about this, I guess, that when it comes to real studies, that in Europe, in particular, the Katz report, the Katz review became well known as the first, basically ended up closing the National Health Services Gender Identity Development Service, which I think carried out a number of these puberty blockers, but it's also been supplemented by studies in Sweden and Finland that all again argue that more or less that not against that kind of intervention, but that there's not sufficient evidence to support that intervention, I think is the correct way to say it. So you want to comment on that at all?
Just briefly, I mean, what we've seen coming from some Scandinavian countries, namely Finland and Sweden, and then the UK, was they commissioned systematic reviews. And so rather than looking, what you'll see in the American media often, there's all these studies pointing to great benefit, and and indeed there's a pile of studies. Now, what the systematic reviews do, in accordance with, principles and evidence-based medicine, is they apply certain methodological tools to compile, synthesize, and assess the quality of that evidence. And when they do that, they've all, the independent researchers commissioned by Swedish health authorities, Finnish health authorities, and UK health authorities, and now we've got also researchers in Canada who've recently published systematic reviews. They all find the same thing, which is that the evidence for benefit for outcomes is really, really weak. I mean, the studies are just plain shoddy. And you can take, there's these studies that get cited repeatedly, and if you show them to somebody who's a methodologist, or even somebody, I've shared it with colleagues, what do you think of this study? And they're immediately aghast. And then they don't even know anything about it.
They don't have any opinions on it. They just look at the methodology itself, and they find that, Yeah.
I mean, there were also, interestingly enough, big problems with the original Dutch research.
That's right.
Foundation of the Dutch protocol. So it's not just sort of subsequent shoddy American studies, but the original Dutch research. It didn't have a control group for one thing.
Yeah, well, as Moti pointed out, with everyone but one being non-heterosexual, that itself is an interesting.
Just to go back to that. I mean, that makes it all the more bizarre that the progressive members of our profession are all on the gender-affirming side, because, like, naively, you would have thought they would have been up in arms saying, "Oh, look, we're just transing the gay away. This is terrible."
Yeah, no, in fact,
and these are treatments. These are treatments that threaten, in some cases, absolutely destroy reproductive, fertility.
Well, yeah,
and generally speaking, when we're carrying out interventions that threaten fertility, sexual function, but especially fertility, and the group of people are a kind of socially marginalized group. Let's say they're African American, or they're Jewish, or they're gay. Worries about things like eugenics will arise, right? Well, you're targeting sterilizing treatments at a vulnerable group of people, and people love to make arguments from eugenics. I mean, you mentioned Peter Singer before.
Many people have lost their jobs because people say
To be clear, I'm not making that argument now, but
no, I
one
know.
would have thought,
Yeah.
given the ease with which people invoke the risk of eugenics, that in this case, somebody would have made that argument, and yet nobody has.
Well,
even if it doesn't work, it's
yeah.
an argument worth considering.
Well, I mean, I think now that segues lovely to the next quote from you guys that I was going to do before moving on, which is, you say the ingredients for a lively and wide-ranging philosophical discussion, debate about the nature of sex and gender, autonomy and paternalism, and the meaning of and moral salience of human diversity, the relation between mind and body, the scope of first-person authority, the aims of science and medicine, the nature and normative significance of identity are laid out. And what we find in the philosophical and bioethics literature, as well as in the public-facing contributions from scholars, is surprisingly limited. And I think that's the point. It's sort of one is surprised at both the limited aspect, and of course you suggest arguments for that in a bit. But the other thing you point out, which is unfortunate, is that ironically it's the branch of the discipline known as feminist philosophy that's exhibited maximum intolerance of dissenters, and go for and anyone who departs from the orthodoxy being called transphobic. And I would therefore be remiss not to ask you, and in fact, what the tactic. Well, there are two tactics, which is openly attack, as we'll talk about. But the other tactic, which is just so frustrating from a scholarly viewpoint, is the no platforming argument. That these people that you can't put them in debate because they're not even worthy of debate. That the idea, so that one can have a discussion, which is, again, the whole point of scholarship. So let's talk about a few examples, and I think the first is Kate Mann, so that you bring up. So why don't you, Alex or Boudry, I don't know who wants to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. So we give this example of Kate Mann's discussion in her recent book, Unshrinking: How to Face Fat Phobia, of both bariatric surgery for obese adolescents, which is endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and gender-affirming care, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and so on, which again is endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it is very striking how Kate's attitude to these two things is completely different. So in the case of bariatric surgery for obese adolescents, she's very alert to the possibility of, cherry picking studies, the fact that bariatric surgery itself, just like any surgery, any major surgery, has like huge downsides and so on. I have no position. I don't know enough about bariatric surgery for adolescents, but I can clearly see that, there's some issue there. And she even mentions suicide, I think, in the context of bariatric surgery. But then when it comes to gender-affirming care, her view is, look, this is just like life-saving medicine that enables trans kids to be who they are. And then she cites this completely crap study, Tordorf 2022, which has been like raked over the coals by Jesse Singal and others. It's like the worst study. And here, it's obvious that motivated reasoning is at work. It just couldn't be plainer. And Kate has, she was actually a graduate student at MIT, so I know her. She is an absolute leader in feminist philosophy, one of the new generation of feminist philosophers. She'll be around setting the agenda for years to come. And she thinks that people like Moti and myself are just a bunch of bigoted transphobes who don't know what we're talking about.
Well, okay, and that's part of the problem here. You give many examples, and I want to obviously encourage people to read this. But the other example you talk about that struck me is Robin Dembroff.
Robin Dembroff.
Dembroff. Yeah. Sorry. So, illuminate that example a little bit.
I'll let Moti talk about Robin. Robin is also not a fan of mine, I should say.
So that's an example where we were wanting to describe how discussions in the academic literature in biomedical ethics lean very, very heavily in one direction, and it's almost impossible to find critical views, skeptical views, alternative views. And so there was a paper published in the American Journal of Bioethics, which is a leading journal in bioethics, in 2019. It's now outdated for a number of reasons. It was outdated when it came out, but that's another story. Arguing that these are life-saving medical interventions. They provide great benefit. And so parents who refuse to consent for their kids should be treated as negligent, and the state should intervene and make the interventions available, even if the parents don't consent. Anyway, so that was the thrust of the paper. Fine, as we say, it's a provocative thesis, and Priest argues for it very clearly, and one can raise objections. And then AJOB, the journal, will publish, it was a Target article, commentaries. And Robin Dembroff was one of the philosopher commentators. And so that's why we focused on the responses that were written by philosophers or bioethicists with serious philosophical training. And what you find is a chorus all saying, yes, you're right. These are great. The state should step in. With some philosophers just saying you didn't go far enough. That was the view was either, but there was nobody saying, well, wait a minute, there were some papers that raised some critical questions, but none among our colleagues in philosophy. So that was where Dembroff came in, and same thing, Dembroff advanced claims about suicidality that are just completely unsupported.
Okay, now you make it becomes clearer in the article what the origin of this lack of debate is likely to be, and it's not surprising, perhaps, given the times. You say there's a sense in philosophy to defend the seemingly indefensible, to have heterodoxy, but you say when heterodoxy brings threats to one's reputation, character, or even livelihood, the pragmatic calculus starts to look very different. If the threats are external, they may be resisted if support from professional colleagues is strong. It's a different story when the threats are coming from inside the house. And you recount two cases, one you've already mentioned, but I would like you to at least recount these two cases, Kathleen Stock, very, very public case, and also Holly Lawford Smith, I guess, to show that basically there is a problem of speaking out and writing a kind of heterodox article that should provoke interesting discussion, but instead provokes attacks, and in fact attacks on one's own not just reputation, but one's own position, and that tends to clam people up. So, Kathleen Stock first, briefly. I mean, I don't want to illuminate the whole this at great length, but people may not know what happened to
her. Moti, do you want to?
Go ahead. I mean, you said a little bit.
Okay. I'll say something more.
Yes, I was going to ask you, Alex, since you brought it up earlier.
Something about Holly.
Yeah.
So there was something called the 2004 Gender Recognition Act in the UK, and around 2017, 2018, the then Conservative government was proposing to amend the act to essentially usher in a form of gender self-identification. And there was a lot of opposition in the UK to that, coming to a significant extent from people on the left, feminists, people in the trade union movement, and so on. And Kathleen started to raise some objections herself to the reforms to the Gender Recognition Act. And it didn't take long for mainstream feminist philosophers to start attacking her for that. And then things just ratcheted up and got worse and worse, and they culminated. So in the 2021 New Year's Honours List, she was awarded the OBE, the Officer of British Empire. This is the gong that I myself am angling for. It sounds so great. She was awarded that in the New Year's Honours List,
It was for contributions to philosophy,
for contributions to like free speech,
free speech, and
yeah. Incidentally, I mean, a trans woman firefighter was among the honorees, so it's not as if only cis people get gongs in the UK. And then after that, there was an extraordinary open letter, basically organized by leaders in feminist philosophy, which is essentially addressed to the then Queen, complaining about Kathleen's OBE and like accusing her of causing various kinds of violence and harm to trans people and so on, and impeding life-saving, gender-affirming care and whatnot. It was the most absurd thing you could imagine, and yet it was signed by about 800 people. And then at her home university, the University of Sussex, protests on the ground started to intensify. I'm not quite sure what the
and there had been
cause of that was, but
just to interject, and throughout this period of time, of course, there are calls for her to be fired. Students are claiming to feel unsafe on campus with her there because she's a bigot that makes them feel that she wants to eradicate, transgender people. These sorts of claims had been advanced already for a couple of years.
And to make it, I'd like to go on longer, but limited time. So eventually she was pressured out of her job.
Yeah, that's right. She resigned later in
she just couldn't take it,
I think.
And then there's the next one, and we'll do this even quicker. Is Holly Lawford Smith, who wrote an article on or was it a book? It was a book, Gender Critical Feminism.
Gender Critical Feminism. Okay, Moti should talk about Holly, but let me just point out that. Not that sexual orientation is relevant to whether your views are correct or not, but just in this general context of the supposedly progressive feminists attacking people like Kathleen and Holly. Both Kathleen and Holly are lesbians.
Yeah.
And, so it's
we see as it's a good thing to have more members of certain minority groups in the academy. And yet when Kathleen Stock was pushed out, that was a cause for celebration among many people in philosophy. Well, we just lost a lesbian and, a lesbian philosopher.
Yeah.
So the story with Holly briefly, she wrote a book called Gender Critical Feminism. She had a contract with Oxford University Press. There were efforts to get OUP to withhold publication of that book. There were a couple open letters, one written by staff at Oxford University.
Yeah, the union representing Oxford, the staff.
Yeah, another by a collection of scholars who had, in one way or another, some relationship with Oxford University Press, having written for them or having edited whatever. A very broad understanding of having a relationship with Oxford University Press. And she had to seek legal, she had another book in the works, also under contract, and had to seek legal representation and received legal support so that her second book on gender critical feminism was indeed published. But she also faced, there was vandalism. She had security for a while at her university in Melbourne. Windows were broken. The same sorts of claims about her mere presence there, making it unsafe because she, endorses the elimination of transgender people and is it's a kind of a genocide that she's advocating for and so forth. She was not pressured out of her job, fortunately, but there were certainly efforts, and she fortunately, was able to keep her job.
I think the key point and a really important sentence in your article is, after this, as every authoritarian knows, suppressed dissent can be indistinguishable from widespread consensus when observed from the outside. So, so people aren't seeing the other side, and therefore they're thinking, okay, well, everyone agrees that this is good. And you said we've heard firsthand from colleagues who that while they think the issues surrounding sex, gender, and health are interesting and important, they're unwilling to engage with them publicly out of fear of social and professional opprobrium. But that the academics are basically terrified most of the time. And so it doesn't help when there's actually a reason for it. But the other argument, and I want to do it very quickly, and you point out, is this even more, I mean, that's awful. But from a scholarly perspective, the notion of non-platforming, of non-engagement, which is almost a position. As you point out, Mark Lance wrote in Inside Higher Education that, quote, to produce arguments in this context that trans women are not women or trans lesbians are not lesbians is not just a view we can easily reject as confused and offensive. It's complicit with systematic violence and active encouragement of oppression. And he urged that those who treat this like an intellectual game should not be engaged with. They should be told to blank, blank, blank. And even the American Philosophical Association, when there was a panel on this, did not have. They were unable to find enough philosophers and bioethicists to participate on these no platform grounds. And in fact, one of you was Moti, I think, likely called an anti-trans activist, this would have been the first panel. But and it's a topic where you'd want a discussion, especially if it's controversial. And the idea from this supposedly scholarly society is no. I mean, and there's a very similar example in the book later on from Elizabeth Weiss, an anthropologist and archaeologist, that in the I think it was in the American Anthropological Society, rather than have a panel on sex and skeletons, they basically said no, we don't want to even discuss it. And it's just that is what is one of the purposes of our book is that this is happening in science where the process of science is being undermined by this ideological by ideology, and it's hurting because science can't proceed without open debate, and the same is true for philosophy, of course. And I wish that we could spend more time, but I want to. You make a series of recommendations, and I'll list them rather than go into them in detail as I was hoping to do with you guys. But one is that, hey, philosophers should have some backbone, but you say that's useless because they're not going to, or particularly in the present context, have some balls, as you put it. But you say that publications probably shouldn't necessarily include the author's autobiographical information or personal narrative. It affects things, and journals should explicitly promote the citation and engagement of opponents instead of the opposite. And you give an example from a paper on gender identity. It said, we have avoided citing other arguments here because we take them to be openly transphobic, and we resist giving them more uptake. So we don't want you to even look at those articles. And then peer review.
But oddly, can I just interject?
Yeah,
they could have
interject. I don't want to dominate.
They could have just said nothing.
Yeah.
So what's the point of saying, well, there are these arguments, they're transphobic and they're terrible, and then not having any citations? Yeah. That was a decision, and what they're doing there is signaling.
Yeah.
Right. What side they're on. They're the good people. There are these bad people out there. They could have just said nothing and remained silent and not even gestured at the other, but they chose to do that. So even there you see
exactly
there's a kind of a tribalism being signaled there, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. And the last thing you say is public philosophy, that if there's problems inside, speak out, which of course even requires more courage. And you guys are doing it, and I appreciate it. But one can try and reach the public directly, because if informed, my experience is generally if you're properly informed, the public often makes has the right attitude. But the big problem is getting information, and if the debate isn't even happening, the public can't be expected to it. Now I'm going to give you guys the final word in two ways. I'm going to read a quote from you, and then I'll give you any if you want to make a comment on it. In your last paragraph, you say the events of the last few years have shown that the scholarly norms of philosophy are much more fragile than one might have hoped. Even though this came as something of a shock to the present writers, perhaps it should not have. Spend time around professional philosophers and you will realize they have no special immunity to fashionable political trends, the latest unreplicable social science research, peer pressure, motivated reasoning, and the temptations of status. And the last line is a requote or an adaptation of another quote. The price of a healthy academy is eternal vigilance, which I think is one of the reasons we publish this. And I think it's a wonderful piece that's important. And I'm just going to give you, if you want to add anything to that, I want to thank you for writing it. And it's a really important, and I want to thank you for having the courage to speak out as both philosophers and bioethicists on this issue. Anything you want to add?
Well, just a couple of things. I mean, first of all, it doesn't really require that much courage. I mean, compared to, the sort of courage exhibited by firefighters when they dash into a burning building or something. I mean, It's like if you're a tenured professor of philosophy and you say some controversial things that draw nasty comments on social media, that doesn't really require that much courage. And the other thing is that, as we say at the end, there's nothing sort of exceptional about philosophy. Philosophers are just as subject, unfortunately, to peer pressure and external influences and other incentives as any other members of the academy. It is a shame, but
it is. One should add, it doesn't take courage. It's much courage if you're established in your career and have tenure, although we've learned in many fields, tenure doesn't really mean anything if the decision is eventually that you're an embarrassment to your views are embarrassing. But one can imagine for junior faculty, it may be a little
for
more.
Sure. Yes, of course. Yes, I didn't mean to. No, I think, for some junior people, it really does.
And they are the future.
For someone, especially for someone like myself, I'm tenured,
nothing to lose.
Fancy institution. Okay, whatever. People are going to say horrible things about me behind my back, but that's really the.
Well, I agree, and I wish more academics felt that way because I've had it's amazing that the sense of fear is deeper than you may even imagine. Maybe not in this area, but when I've written about this publicly, I've had many academics write me when I've written in say the Wall Street Journal or something, and I get lots of letters, usually almost always in a private email account, and often under an assumed name, saying I don't want my colleagues to know how I think. And boy, when you hear that in academia, you wonder what's happening. So, and that was a big motivator for me in wanting to put a internal book together, not criticizing academia from outside, but from inside. And anyway, it's been a pleasure to talk to both of you and actually physically sort of meet you both. I hope we get together. I'm hoping we'll actually have an event in Cambridge and a few other places around the country where we can bring some of the writers in. But thank you again.
Well, that would be great. Thanks very much, Laura.
Thanks, Lawrence, for hosting this.
Hi, it's Lawrence again. As the Origins podcast continues to reach millions of people around the world, I just wanted to say thank you. It's because of your support, whether you listen or watch, that we're able to help enrich the perspective of listeners by providing access to the people and ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world and driving the future of our society in the 21st century. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also leave us private feedback on our website if you'd like to see any parts of the podcast improved. Finally, if you'd like to access ad-free and bonus content, become a paid subscriber at originsproject.org. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation as a non-profit effort committed to enhancing public literacy and engagement with the world by connecting science and culture. You can learn more about our events, our travel excursions, and ways to get involved at originsproject.org. Thank you.